With me the whole time, right?
Yeah, I'll save this for later.
Well, there you go.
All right, thank you. That was great.
Birthday magic.
Rebecca, everyone.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to open this thing so I don't have to fumble with it later. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. Like Kim was saying, I've been coming to Creative Mornings for a while now, so I was actually pretty stoked to be someone actually giving a talk here. So today I'm going to give a talk that I call Making Magic. Like you all know, I'm an experience design director at RGA Chicago. RGA is a global digital agency that concentrates on finding relevant connections between brands and consumers, and digital and technology are at the heart of what we do. I happen to be a designer who thinks about magic a lot in their work. And I feel like I define magic as the ability to create wonder and mystery and delight in your work. Disney has always been well known for creating magic. They create these fantastical narratives with characters that are so developed and believable and relatable and capture an audience's heart. I feel like we're all secretly searching for that same magic in our own work. The spark of inspiration that fuels us in what we do, that constant itch that we have to find an idea that is innovative and totally captivating. But the problem is we're not Disney animators. A lot of us are designers that have clients and brand guidelines that we have to follow and deadlines in our work. So finding magic can be hard sometimes in what we do. But today I'm going to share with you how I found magic in my own work throughout creating what I call the Principles of Ux Choreography. And throughout developing this idea and forming these principles and sharing them and seeing them implemented in our work, I learned a lot about how I can continue to find magic in my own work, and hopefully I can share that with you all today so that you can continue to find it in yours too. So real quick, out of curiosity, I wanted to kind of take a poll of the room. How many of you are UX designers in here? Oh, we got a good turnout. Visual designers? Copywriters? Okay, cool. And I'm sure the rest of you do something way cooler than me. So UX designers are responsible for how things work. Behind every digital experience, there is someone who is thinking through the functionality of an experience and thinking through every possible scenario that someone might encounter. And we have to put together that puzzle and connect the dots. We're often creating the skeleton for an experience. We call them wireframes. They kind of look like blueprints. And that's when we define what an experience may be. We are part of the creative process from end to end. So we're working together with strategy. We have to research who our users are. We concept ideas. We see through their execution. And then we have to understand how people are engaging with them in real life. We often have to ask ourselves questions like, what are people's behaviors? What are their motivations? What are their needs and habits? And how do we want to make them feel? It's a process that's really centered around empathy. A former boss of mine used to always say, you're creating things for people, and those people are not you. What's also interesting about our role is that it often feels invisible in the end products that we create. So day to day, we're creating wireframes and prototypes and things like user journeys and ecosystems, but a lot of that just recedes into the background of the end products that we create. We don't necessarily design to get noticed. In fact, sometimes we know we did our job right if people don't notice and they get through an experience without any problem. And we know that some of the greatest design can be invisible. So over time, these are just some of the brands that I've worked with while at RGA, and they span any and every type of industry, whether it's entertainment, luxury retail, healthcare, food, or telecommunications. And what's interesting about our role is we always have to take into account not only what is best for users, but what also makes sense for a brand and a business. So it's an interesting challenge. It's what keeps our role kind of exciting. And all the while, we also have to take into account what is going to make an experience feel unique and ownable for these brands. So after working as a UX designer for a couple years, I got to a point where I was really searching for what deeply excited me in my work and the unique point of view that I brought. And I think without even knowing it, I was just secretly searching for the magic in my work. I had a goal, a tiny goal at the time, to just give a design talk. Not only because I wanted to practice public speaking at the time, but I figured if I'm giving a talk, I need a topic, and maybe the topic will force me to look at what excites me in my work, and maybe I'll do some soul searching while figuring this all out. So I was trying to go through dozens of topics because I was trying to form a point of view in my work. I felt like all these good designers above me were really excited about a subject matter expertise they had or a particular area that they were passionate about, and I wanted that same thing in my work. So I went through all of these topics, but the problem was I either didn't feel like an expert in it, so I kind of felt like an imposter, or I felt like it had been done before, so it didn't feel original, or I just wasn't excited about it, and I didn't want to force it. All the while, there was a tiny part of me that had this vague idea of motion design in my mind. And it seemed a little obscure, and I didn't know how people would perceive the idea because it seemed outside the lines of what our role was as a UX designer, and I didn't know if people would be like, why are you talking about that? That has nothing to do with what you do. But it was in my mind because I had a bit of a background in it. I took a course while at Carnegie Mellon that was called Time Motion Communication, and it was all about kinetic typography and rhythm and color and movement. And my professor used to describe each element on screen as if it were an actor on a stage. Each was a character that we had to direct and give it behavior and personality. At the time, introducing time and motion changed everything for me because what I realized was that it gave you precise control over the emotion that you're trying to convey and how an audience interprets that message. So at the time, I was like, I want to be a title sequence designer. I could do this all day and not get bored with it. And then I got a job in UX, which is like a totally different story. What started to happen was scenarios would come up at work where a developer might approach me looking at the wireframes they were making, and he would say, okay, you annotate at this part, like if a user's going to click on this button, this next thing should appear. And they'd ask me, well, how do you want that to transition? Do you want it to be like a card flipping, or do you want it to like fade in? And I'd be like, great question. I didn't think about it. So we'd think of something on the spot, and I'd always be kicking myself after because I'm like, I feel like I'd be doing so much better at this. Like, I feel like I learned this stuff in school and it somehow relates to what I'm doing. And I have to understand that better. And I didn't know why like none of us were thinking about it. If our job is designed for interaction, why aren't we thinking this through more? So what I started to do was go into a complete deep dive of any example of motion design that I could find being used in digital. So these weren't just like moments where you see like an icon animating when you open an app, but the moments that provide like a true cognitive benefit to using motion, the moments where you can help with things like guiding someone's focus or helping them complete a task or navigate in an environment and overall create a more polished experience. And the more that I started to pay attention to everything I was interacting with, the more I started to see a pattern in these moments. And it started to click. I was like, maybe what we need is a set of principles that designers can reference that'll help us think about how and when and why to use motion design in our work. So I called them the Principles of Ux Choreography. And I called him that because my professor used to always say, you are responsible for designing each element's entrance, performance, and exit. And it always seemed like a choreographed scene in my mind. I started to realize that UX choreography was the combination of the how with the when and why, the proper techniques of applying motion design combined with the most integral moments of user experience where you can start to have this two-way dialogue with your user. These 5 principles started to become the source of magic in my work. Throughout the process of creating these, I realized there's so many similarities between the themes that I see in these with many other disciplines. In fact, a lot of them were inspired by these principles that Disney made decades ago called Disney's Principles of Animation. And along the way, I ended up collaborating with a Disney animator, Glenn Keane, on them. Glenn Keane is the animator behind characters such as Ariel and the Little Mermaid and Beast and Beauty and the Beast and Pocahontas. And as we were collaborating, we tried to approach these together and look at the parallels in our work and see what can we learn from how Disney designs for these scenes and apply them into the context of digital. So as I'll go through them, any of the illustrations that you see are drawings that Glenn did in our presentation. So the first of these principles is feedback. Feedback helps demonstrate the result of a user's interaction and whether or not it was successful and why. So it's often used to show if something's correct or incorrect, if progress is being made, if something's loading, or simply when you've selected items on screen. It's important to give people feedback because over time it builds trust. And it's really satisfying for users to see over time. And not only that, it adds a tactile element. It feels less like you're tapping on a piece of glass and more like you're interacting with these elements on screen. When Disney thinks about designing for a scenario like this, they use exaggeration. So if you were to imagine a scene where Beast is telling Belle to come down for dinner and she says, "I'm not coming," you can imagine that his expression goes from this furrowed face with his face crunched down and really angry to this elongated, surprised look in his eyes. And when you see that really quickly, it starts to feel like a jolt. It becomes something that is felt and not just seen. So that's when you can tell that you're effectively giving feedback to someone when it becomes that obvious to them. So a few examples of how this comes through in digital. First off, the iconic iOS password shake. So it's like a head shake saying no. And the first time people ever saw this, it was immediately intuitive because this is how we give each other feedback in real life. Yahoo News is a more delightful example where all these circles for the articles you read light up one by one, and they collapse in the middle, and you're rewarded with a full screen fact at the end. Dots, another delightful example where first this row of dots lights up, then the borders, then the whole screen goes purple, and another layer of dots falls in, and it's just a nice sequence to that interaction. And lastly, beats. Every time you're tapping on these genres, they get really large, and you also see a progress bar start to build, so it's a cue for you to understand how much more you have to go. So that's feedback, all about demonstrating interaction results. That brings us to our second principle, which is what I call feed forward. Feed forward is really just a form of hinting. The same way that a writer might foreshadow what is going to happen in a story, we think about what are the cues that we can hint at to help people complete their tasks and avoid confusion and get around this environment. Often these are really subtle details, but they can make all the difference in the world. They hint at things like, pay attention and look here, or just pull this a little bit further, or you're allowed to drop that there. The key here is to think about this idea of anticipation. Anticipate someone's needs, their mindset, and what you want them to go through. If you were to imagine a sequence where Mickey is looking at a ball across the table and he's about to reach over and grab it, the first time we showed this, we only had the first and third drawing. So Mickey's first looking at the ball with his hands right here, and then the next, his hand is already on it. And we're like, that's all you need, right? He completed the action. The problem here is there's no waiting for Christmas. You can't just assume that an audience is always in your mind and knows where you're going to take them. And you have to take the time to give them a signal for where you're about to take them. So a simple gesture, just like an open hand starting to reach across the table, becomes a symbol to the audience that we're about to take you in this direction. If the audience isn't with you, nobody's happy. So you want to make sure that you take the time to bring them along in that. So a couple examples. In this photo app, what I like about it is all these templates slide into place, and then there's a little peek at the controls that live behind the screen, so people immediately understand where they can go to start interacting. In Google Translate, these pulsing rings signal to someone that it's listening and that you can start speaking now. Pinterest uses what they call skeleton pins, so they'll show you the average color of a pin that's about to load. And it gives people reassurance in a way, because they know that something's loading and it's on the way and it's not broken and it's stuck. Facebook does something similar where all the lines like glow a little bit before your feed loads. So again, it's just reassuring to know something's working in the background. And lastly, Monument Valley. What I love here is how the castle will first spin a little bit on its own, so people immediately understand this is how I start to navigate around this castle into different worlds. So that's feed forward, all about hinting. The third principle is spatial awareness. Spatial awareness is all about orienting a user with their environment and clarifying the relationship between elements. It's especially important on smaller screens because you have to properly strategize how to use the little screen real estate that you have in order to reduce complexity. If you think about it, every single time that users interact with a new digital environment, they have to learn that space. They have to understand where things come from, where they go next, and where they can find them again. So it's your responsibility to really ease people through those transitions so that things don't feel like a sudden change and they stay grounded and they understand where they can find these elements again. When Disney thinks about designing for this, they use what they call staging. It's setting up a scene in a way where every element is working together to guide your focus and understand where you're about to take them next. In Glenn's animated short Duet, there's a scene where Mia is jumping into the water and swimming a little bit and then jumping out of it. And if you look at the breakdown of the character's position and where they are on screen, he's always paying attention to the character's position and how that interacts with certain elements, whether it's crossing this plane of the different rocks and entering the water, the way that the bubbles form an arrow so you understand she's about to go down, the way the fish form an arrow to the right, so you know she's about to swim in that direction. And even the way the sand at the bottom of the pond is like squeezing her out of the water, so you know that she's about to swim out of it. So what I like about seeing it broken down like this is that it feels like there's a connected thread to everything happening, and it's a good way to think about how you're going to guide someone's attention through an environment. In this calendar app, it feels like a seamless transition from days of the week left and right, and then it's as if you're reaching back into space and pulling something forward. In Visco, it feels like all of these little controls live in drawers at the bottom of the screen. You know that's where you can find them again. You pull them up, slide left and right, and then put them back when you're finished. Waze just has a nice sequence to these layers of navigation where every step you understand how you're grounded and how you got there and how you can exit back out of that. And lastly, Nike Making feels like you tap on a category and it comes forward into space, and then it scoots up and all these categories fall below it, so you understand that whole sequence of how you arrived there. So that's spatial awareness. It's all about orientation. The fourth principle is what I call user focus. User focus is all about guiding people's attention and clarifying change states. It's all about these transitions and hierarchy at each moment in time. Hierarchy is something that all of us have to think about in our work. And for us, we're thinking about how do we give a hierarchy to the type of actions that we want people to complete in this moment. It may not be as simple as just bringing something to the foreground and making it really bold and obvious, but again, think through how every element on screen might be working together to convey something to you. When Disney thinks about providing focus on a scene, they sometimes use what they call the plausible impossible. As long as something is for the benefit of an audience, there are moments where you can get away with things a little bit. So in this old film called Little Whirlwind, Mickey's being chased around by a little whirlwind. He's trying to hold this basket on the ground and put leaves in it, and it keeps scooting out of the way. And he can't figure out what to do until all of a sudden, he's going to pull a hammer out of his pants. And the first time you see it, you don't really question it because you're like, that's all you need in this moment to tell that story effectively. And when he's done, you can just put it in your pants again. So when you see that, people aren't going to be like, why does Mickey walk around with a hammer in his pants? They're just going to think through, oh, that was like funny. That's all he needed in that moment. And so it's a good way to think about how to bring clarity to a moment. Like in UI, we often have what we call contextual controls. So these little actions that are important, you always want to have it on hand. And you know that they're there all the time, but you don't need to see them until the moment that they're needed. So you don't question why in Pinterest you put your thumb down and these little buttons are popping out of it, but it's all you need in that moment. Paper notifications just have a nice sequence to this transition of hierarchy. You tap on the globe to see notifications. It first bounces a little bit, a tray slides out, and you see a nice glow to the header. In this calendar app, what I like is that you're trying to make your selections for an alarm. Everything scoots out of the way. Your selections get really bold and obvious, and then they collapse into place back where you started. And lastly, one of my favorite examples has always been Yahoo News. They have this little feature. It's the first thing that catches your eye when you scroll all the way down, and it's these windmills that are turning at the speed of like the wind mile per hour that day. And I always liked it because at a glance, you can just get a feel for what the wind is going to be like. So if it's a typical day in Chicago, it's always pretty brutal. But I always thought that was really smart, a way to guide someone's attention without having to just read all of that information. So that's user focus. And that brings me to the fifth and final principle, which is admittedly the hardest to design for, but it's your brand tone of voice. These are the details that start to add expression and personality and identity throughout an experience. And it's what influences the emotional aspect of your work. The same way that we often have copywriters who are thinking through tone of voice and they say, if a brand were to speak to us, what would it say? Think about if a brand were to move, what would it feel like? These are the details where I feel like the invisible starts to become visible in our work. And when you get it right, people smile and they have a moment where they're like, I could totally see a brand doing that because that felt so right. What works for one brand doesn't necessarily work for another. If you were to take the whimsical interactions that you find in Snapchat and switch that with something you might see in Nike, it just wouldn't feel right because it's not authentic. Getting these details right can be important. Like if you think about all the apps and services that you use day to day and why you keep using them, chances are there's dozens of other apps out there that can do the same exact thing. And they might have a good user experience too, but people always gravitate towards the same few. And it's because they do something more. It's like they enable you, they delight you, they have emotional appeal to them. So appeal is the last Disney technique we referenced. And it's really a mysterious thing. And when Glenn described it to me, he said, you know when you have it, and you know when you don't have it, but you don't know how to get it. But when you get it right, it feels like a perfect chord and the harmony of elements. We would talk about the new look of Mickey, which was designed by an animator named Freddie Moore. Before this look and feel of Mickey, we used to joke that the old Mickey looked just like a friendly rat, and now there's something lovable about this new one. And it's because every line relates to another line. If you look at the way the curve of his nose is following the shape of his face, and his eyebrows are following that too, and even the curve of his ears, everything is working together in harmony. And it's creating something that resonates with an audience. And I think that's a good way to think about it, is how can we take the brands that we work with and take them to this area that resonates with our audience. So a few examples of moments that have become really iconic for brands. First off, the ghosts that you always see in Snapchat that are always messing around and you don't know what crazy thing they're going to do next, but they've become such an ownable part of that experience. Airbnb has these little illustrations of homes around the world every time you do a search, and it becomes something that you start to look forward to every time you're in that experience. Starbucks has this iconic cup with your stars that falls into it, and you can shake it around. And granted, this is totally unnecessary in the experience, but people love it because they can just play with it while they're waiting around. And lastly, Slack, which has kind of become well known for all these Easter eggs, the hidden moments that are really funny in the experience, like when you reach the bottom of a feed and it says you're all done and you see these emojis appear. So think about the moments where you can start to translate the tone of voice and the ownable branded moments in your experience and how you can start to connect with your users on the emotional aspect as well. These 5 principles, for me, started to help me understand the ways in which I can better connect with an audience and create that two-way dialogue. But as you saw, there's many themes in here that translate across different disciplines. So there's a lot to be borrowed from what's outside the lines in your work. And after forming these principles, I felt like I still had a lot to learn about them and the way that we'd apply them to our work process. My biggest question is, when in the process should we be thinking about this? And what I realized was that the best time is really at the beginning, when every creative discipline is going through a discovery phase. Like visual is thinking through mood boards for color and typography and imagery and iconography, and copy is forming tone of voice. I like to just build off of what they're doing. If visual is thinking through how something looks and copy is thinking through how something speaks, it's our turn to think about how something behaves in that moment. So when we were designing for UFC, for example, our visual team was going through a whole exploration of what the new identity could be and what we wanted that experience to feel like. And they would describe all of their directions, and in this one they would use keywords like, it evokes a sense of dynamic movement with these linear elements. There's stark contrast, there's hyper-real photography that makes these fighters feel larger than life. It's crisp, it's innovative, it's immersive. And copy was thinking through how when we talk about these fights and fighters, it's a chance for them to secure their place in history because it's a culmination of all their training and efforts, and you want them to feel heroic. And so many of those keywords were sticking with me, and even when I would just look at the UI elements that they were exploring, I could just start to imagine how some of it would behave. So my goal for this project and all of my others going forward was to come up with at least 3 keywords that I felt like could describe a brand's behavior. So for this one, for example, we established strong, swift, and clean. So strong because it was inspired by the athleticism of these fighters. Swift because it felt like a quick jab or a punch. Or clean because at the end of the day, we wanted to create a premium service, and there's also a precision to what they're doing. So establishing these up front helped us because not only did it give us like a shared form of communication amongst our team, but everything started to feel more cohesive in the interactions that we were designing. Every time we would come up with a scenario with a micro interaction, and we'd have to think through how are we going to design that behavior, we had these pillars to ladder up to make sure it justified our design decisions. And not only that, but it also helped our client imagine the type of experience that we were trying to create and why we were doing what we were doing. So you can imagine in a scenario like a simple onboarding flow where you're asking people what they like to watch. It might feel like every time they make a selection, it feels like it's punching forward and a progress bar slides forward in a swift manner. And there's a precision to how things are translating. During a live event, we had these modules below the live video playing where you would see fighter information, and we'd have to think through how do they transition between fights, the way that live stats might wipe clean. Or this voting module at the bottom, like every time that you click someone's name, we wanted to feel like a punch forward. So every little moment where we felt like this could benefit from motion and communicating to an audience, we wanted to ladder up to those words. And granted, so many of these are way more subtle, like the way that a navigation opens and slides left and right, or the way that a carousel of video thumbnails slides across and all the hover states that you appear. Yes, granted, when you see those on by themselves, like you don't necessarily think of UFC or a brand like in an instant. But the thing is, when you're thinking through every interaction and experience and giving every bit of it this level of detail and attention, it starts to compound, and people slowly start to pick up on that in an experience, and they start to feel that become ownable and uniquely identifiable for that experience. I often describe it as the way you get to know a person better and you pick up on their mannerisms over time. That's what starts to happen in a digital experience in a way. In retrospect, when I think about magic, I realize that that desire that I had to find what excited me in my work was secretly the search for magic. And I feel like all of us have that. We are all capable of finding that to figure out what excites you in your work. And when you find that and you identify it, you just have to harness it and see how you can continue to translate that. So stay curious in all of your work, and don't be scared to look outside the lines of what your role is and wait for permission to go explore that. See what you can borrow outside of your role and how that it can inform and enhance what you do. Find the spark in your work, and when you do, harness that and nurture it and give it attention and try to think through every possible way that you can integrate that on your work. Find opportunities for the invisible to become visible, because these are the moments that will truly resonate with your audience and stick with them. It's what becomes memorable. So define the characters in your work and develop them and give attention to that emotional aspect. And lastly, pass the baton and share the magic. I don't know how much you know about Disney's original animators, but they nicknamed them the 9 Old Men. And they're the ones who came up with Disney's principles of animation, because at the time a new generation of animators was coming in and they had to find a way to pass on all of their learnings and also share what made Disney magic to them. And Glenn Keane was in that generation of new animators, and his mentor, Ollie Johnston, told him, I feel like I'm passing the baton to you with these principles, and you're going to do bigger things than me one day. And Glenn had no idea what he was talking about. He's like, yeah, right, Pinocchio is the biggest thing I'm ever going to do. And then he made The Beauty and the Beast. But when we collaborated, he said the sweetest thing. He's like, I feel like I'm passing the baton to you. And I was like, oh my God, I hope I don't drop it. And I started to see a responsibility in a way that I'm like, these principles are bigger than just what they are in improving my own craft. It's a chance for me to share the spark of magic that I found in my work. Because when you share magic, people are more likely to find theirs too. And we can only collectively improve together and inspire one another, and that's how our work will get better. And that's all I got. Thank you.